pour yourself a cup of coffee, get in your most comfortable chair, and let's get ready to master Lightroom Mobile from A to Z. And while you're at it, save this video as a reference because I'm gonna be sharing things that I've learned over the last 10 years as a photographer and videographer. And as a bonus, I'm gonna share two of the most valuable things that I have ever learned that make such a big difference in the edit. So first, we just need to download Lightroom Mobile. There's links in the description for both iOS and Android users. So once you download that, you're gonna see that you have three different options at the bottom of the screen. One's gonna say device, one's gonna say Lightroom, and one's gonna say community. Device is basically your camera roll. This is everything that's coming from your device. Lightroom, if we go ahead and tap on that, it is where we're gonna do all of our editing. It also gives us different camera functionality, so I can actually click on the camera icon and I can see that I have access to a full-blown camera without having to pay another app, which is really cool. And then I have community. And this is where I can share my work, or I can also get inspiration from other people on the program. So we're going into the device, and we can toggle through all of our different media by just clicking on the top left where it says raw right now. You'll see the top part is actually all different albums that are on the device. So it can go from recents, you can make different folders, and you can pull it from there. On the next one, we have media type. And here, if you haven't set up folders, you can go ahead and select your different photos based on where you're taking it. I just wanna show you a quick side note. If we go into our photo app, we can actually go ahead and click select, and we can grab all of these different images. And if we just click this icon on the bottom left, the share icon, we can add to an album. That's one way to add things to an album, and you can either just add them to an album already, or you can make a new album. Additionally, if you just had one photo that you wanted to add to an album, you could choose it, click on the top right, the three buttons, and add to an album. And again, just do this. This is a really nice thing that you can be able to do on your phone to keep things organized, especially if you know you want to edit this later. So now if we go into Lightroom, we can also just click on the plus with the picture icon, and we can see again, I can find and navigate from here as well. I have device, files, connect the camera card, or I can also connect an SD card to this, which is really, really nice, especially if you're on the go. Go ahead and look at the Lightroom editing processes. Okay, so now we have a photo that's reset, and I just wanna go through the bottom 5 icons real quick. We have different presets where we can create our own, or we have a few different presets that you can just go ahead and one click and it'll edit them. And that could be really great. And you can go ahead and save these. These are your own different presets. There's some built-in ones like neutral, natural, bright, high contrast. These are all great starting points. Creative, there's a few different ones that are all different presets in here, and you can even purchase and add your own into here. So I think they have premium where you can buy them from Adobe, but you can also buy them externally and upload them as well. We're not gonna get into that right now. So the next question that I wanna talk about is the crop tool. So we have different options in which we can go ahead and change the settings. So if I knew I was gonna change this to vertical, I could go ahead and see what the crop looks like. And if it's locked, I can go ahead and make sure that the crop stays the same. And if it's unlocked, then I can just change it however I want, but that's not necessarily what we wanna do. So let's go ahead and reverse that. We do have a straighten option, which I always recommend getting in the habit of doing. This is one thing that I would always check is my straighten. Here, it did a good job. Sometimes it doesn't, and you need to level it yourself. We can rotate the image. Sometimes when you get photos from your SD card and you took it in vertical and horizontal, you'll notice that some of your photos will be rotated, so you can just go ahead and rotate them in here. You can also flip them. So that's pretty much how the crop tool works. So then you have this editing tool, and this is gonna access all of our different editing features. Masking, this is gonna be the number one thing that I'm gonna recommend and the thing that I'm gonna talk about later. I'll go into full detail. Okay, so we have an eraser option, and maybe it'll work on this image. There's this light socket. Let's see if the generative tool can remove it. So I'm just gonna draw over it. As you can see, I'm not like overly careful. That works pretty good. Now, it doesn't always work. Let's just see if we can push it a little bit further and see if it'll do it on this. See how well of a job it does. And there should be an option to refine it and choose from different oh, dang. Okay, so that is the eraser tool. That's pretty cool. I'm impressed with how well that worked. So now we're gonna go into the meat and potatoes of the Lightroom editing app. So if we go and click edit, we have all of these different options. We have light, color, blur, effects, detail, and optics, as well as profiles again. So going through it, I'll show you what everything does, and then I'm gonna show you how I would actually edit it. Light, we have the ability to adjust the exposure. which one of the reasons why I always recommend shooting in RAW, even on your smartphone when you know you're gonna be editing your apps, is because when you shoot in RAW, you can adjust the exposure. You have a wiggle room of plus or minus 2 full exposure stops. And to give you an idea of what that means, you can go, that's 1.72, so that's 2. So I can make things a lot brighter. So if I shot it really dark, I still have that flexibility without losing any quality. And now if I shot it too bright, sometimes I can pull it back down 2 full stops. That's when I recommend shooting in RAW, because then you'll have all this extra leeway to edit your photos. What contrast is gonna do is it's gonna grab all of your pixels that are in the middle and it's gonna push them to the edges. So it's gonna make all of your whites whiter and it's gonna make all of your darks, all of your blacks blacker. So it's gonna give this really interesting contrast effect. So if we look at it, you can see you got like a lot of extra crispiness, but in the face, like it's not super pleasing. It just goes from hard to light really quick. And if I just click and hold, you can see the before and after. And so anytime that you're making any edits, just simply tapping on the photo and giving it a quick hold, you can see the before, release, and you can see what you're doing. This is a really handy tool. Another nice thing is I don't maybe necessarily want this change, so I can just double click and it'll go back to 0. Highlights, it's gonna make the brightest part of your image brighter. So here you might see it in the eyes, you might see it in the light blue. It's just affecting the brightest parts of the image. Shadows, it's gonna affect the darkest parts of the image and just make them get darker. And then if you lift it up, you're gonna make it brighter. The mistake that I always made when I first started editing is I wanted to decrease my highlights and increase my shadows so I had as much dynamic range as possible. And I thought, this is how I did a lot of my editing in the beginning. And if you do that, that's fine. But at these extremes, it doesn't look good. Like, look at that. Like that looks so much better than that. I'd rather not have edited it than do that. So, always work in subtleties. Less is more, and then when I show you the masking part, you're really gonna see like, dang, less really is more. You just wanna stack them and you wanna do localized edits. Anyhow, whites cranks everything up. You can see we're overexposing this image quite a bit. Crank it down, we're losing a lot of depth and we're getting a little bit more of a flat image. What we're doing now, one of the things I wanna bring up is, in this exposure panel, we're talking global. It's affecting all parts of the image. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. It's gonna come helpful in a little bit. And then blacks. We can change our blacks up and we can get kind of like this lifted shadows, or we can crank them down and really crush our blacks. Okay, so now that we see all of what it can do, I wanna show you how I would do the edit with these particular things. The first thing I would do is maybe come and, I think that's pretty well exposed, maybe just a tiny bit. I reduce the contrast a little bit. And now what I wanna do is, I wanna set my whites and my blacks before I do anything else. And so the way that I do that is I just click and hold on the whites circle, and then hold on the image, and I will slide it. So what's happening is where all these blues and reds and yellows are showing, it's showing where it's overexposed. So I wanna just go to right where it's about to. It's saying, what's happening is it's clipping that information. It's saying there's nothing there, it's white. It's white as white, I can't do anything with it. So I want to just bring it to where there's just a tiny bit of details. And I know that is pure white. And now I'm gonna do the same thing to the blacks. So I'm gonna go to the black and I'm gonna tap on the screen and I will start bringing the blacks wherever they have to go in order to have just a tiny bit showing. So that's how I know that now I have really great white point and I have a really great black point, and now I can just stay within that parameter. This would be when I would now adjust my shadows. And again, I told you back in the day, I used to really like to just increase my shadows a lot, but now I find I'm more satisfied by just decreasing my shadows a little bit. And then the same thing with my highlights. I'm gonna actually crank them up a little bit. Oh, I'll zoom my shadows. I'm gonna crank them up a little bit, and that would be basically my edit. We can see the before and after. Super subtle. We're not doing a whole lot. In my opinion, less is more, and we'll build upon it. So now we're gonna go into our color tab. First, we have the option of adding black and white, just swap in the filter, really easy. We have white balance, which can be as shot, auto, or custom. And you could even go ahead and click this eyedropper and then try to find something. Now, when I first started out with Lightroom, I used to think I'd want to try to find a white object and use that as my white balance. But really what you want to do is you want to find a neutral color halfway between white and halfway between black, which ends up being gray. So you can just look for if there's any gray things in this image, There really isn't, but we can try it on the eye and just see what happens. I think this white balance is pretty good. Like, I'm happy with it, but if we wanted to make it warmer, feel like we're outside a tropical destination, we could just adjust our temperature a little bit. And if we wanna make it cooler, you know, maybe we're in the snow, it's winter, we wanna make people feel like it's a little bit cold, just slide it a little bit to the blue. Again, if we wanna undo anything, we can just double tap. It's making a liar out of me. Okay, we can just double tap and we'll go right back. Vibrance, we'll go ahead and increase the vibrancy in your image. And again, be subtle here, don't overdo it. I used to always overdo my saturation. Now I typically use my vibrance first, and then if I wanna do any saturation, maybe I'll just do a little bit, but it's really, really easy to overdo your saturation. And I'll show you how to adjust colors in a better way in a second. So now we have color grading. So you can see here on this first wheel, we have shadows. If I slide over, it's midtones. Slide over one more, we have highlights. Now what this does is it allows us to put certain colors in our shadows and in our highlights. And the way that I like to think about this is a part of what is called color contrast. So when we can add contrast in a slider, we can add contrast in a curves, we can add contrast with the contrast slider, we can add contrast by increasing our whites and increasing our blacks, by increasing our highlights and decreasing our shadows. There's a lot of different ways to create contrast, but a really unique one is with color. So when we think of shadows, we typically are in cooler weather, right? Like, you're in the shadows. So when you think of a color that's cool, you typically think of blue. So what you would typically want to do is just add a little bit of blue, and the further pronounced it is towards the end, the more saturation it is. The closer it is to the middle, the more subtle it's going to be. And again, I recommend being more subtle. So you can set it, and then you can slide your finger around to find the correct color that you want. So there's like this cool teal in the background. So I feel like I can lean into that, and I'm happy with that. And the before, after. It's very, very subtle. That might even be a little bit too much. Okay, that's nice. In our midtones, we could do the same thing, and you can see as I slide it around how much of an effect it's having. And it's having the biggest impact on our skin and the wood. So what I could do is recognize, like, okay, the midtones in this image are a little bit orange, so I could either just lean into that a little bit or not even touch it, which is what I'm gonna opt to do on this image. For highlights, again, we can add any color, and you can see it's really adjusting like the brightest parts of the image. And what I would wanna do is, if I wanted to accentuate this image, I added blue to the shadows. The opposite of blue would be orange. So I could just add a little bit of warmth to our highlights and be really subtle with it. Look at that. Very subtle, very nice, but you can see it brings out a pleasing color. In Megan's skin tones, you really can't tell that too much is done to this image, which is exactly what we want. We don't want to overdo it. And at the end of the highlights, midtones, and shadows, we always have the ability to adjust the luminance, how bright it is or how dark it is. And we also have the ability to blend it to make it even more subtle, and to make it the balance between the shadows or the highlights. And so I'm just gonna leave it right in the middle. I'm gonna blend, I'm gonna go over to the highlights, and I'm also gonna blend it there. Perfect. Now, if I wanted to do a global one, again, you could do it here, but I never do this. I think that's color. So now we have blur, and the blur effect is basically like the portrait mode on your camera phone. So there's two different ways to do this. One, you can just press on the focus, and it's gonna choose a subject for us. And we could also just kind of slide this scale around until it's on the thing that we want to focus on, which would be Megan's face. Or we could also use the circle and place it exactly where it is. And basically what this will do is it'll make everything blurrier if we want. And we have different types of shapes that we can make the blur to. And this one's not giving us so much. I think maybe if we put it on, let's put it on the glass so we can get more of the idea of what it looks like. But basically, this is a tool that we can use to draw our viewer's eye to a very specific thing. Here, we're bringing it to the glass, but in a real world, I'd probably want to bring it to the face, unless, you know, this is like a product. But so that's how it works. We have different looks that you can try to emulate certain types of camera irises. That's basically it. I'm not gonna use that. The one that I use pretty often is actually made popular by Ansel Adams. It's called a vignette. And if we slide it to the right, it'll make a white vignette. And if we slide it to the left, it'll make a black vignette. And what this will do is it just basically creates another way for our eye to go towards the center of the image. It's just trying to put a lot of focus on the center of the image, and it's really nice. I often use it almost on every image, and I do it very subtly. I don't typically do it from here, but you have that option. And you can, let's make it really dramatic so you can see. So midpoint, it's just basically how far is this effect going? If I have it really far, or I could have it like really far out, really far in, really far out. Roundness, how round is it gonna be? Is it gonna be kind of square, or is it gonna be very round? I would go for the very round. Feather, is it gonna be very hard, no feather, or is it gonna have a lot of feathering? I would recommend going on the side of feathering. And highlights, is it gonna affect in the highlights, or is it not gonna affect in the highlights? Okay, so let's go ahead and reset that, because I don't really want any of that. We also have the ability to add grain. This can be something if you have no noise in your image and you wanna add a little bit of grunge, a little bit of noise, you have that option. I don't typically do that, but you have that option. Now we're moving on to detail. This gives you the ability to sharpen your image. Sometimes when we take photos, we want to add a little bit of sharpening to a selective spot, so that way it can make the image pop a little bit more. So what we would do is just drag up our sharpening. And if we look around, like at the eye here, we can see this, it starts to look not so great. What we wanna do is you wanna go to this masking tab, and again, select it, and then tap on the screen. And you want to bring it to just the edges of the things that you want in focus. So this is much better. My hand's a little bit focused, the hair's looking nice, her shirt. That's probably where we want to keep our sharpening. We wouldn't want to apply it to everything because it'll just look funny. So then we can go ahead and adjust our radius a little bit and our detail. You can be aggressive in this spot as long as you really are using the technique that I showed you to get selective, like really refine on it. You do not want to do this globally all over everything. It'll just look really nasty, trust me. Noise, this is where this image isn't gonna have a lot of noise, but if we zoom in, maybe in here, you can see it's just kind of smoothing it out. This is really gonna work great at like concerts when you're indoors at night. Again, same thing with color noise. Let's see if it does anything. This is a bad example for color noise, but basically there's little purple, green, blue, yellow specks sometimes that'll pop into your color, and this would be where you can come in and refine it. Lastly, we have optics, and one of the things that I always recommend is remove chromatic aberration. It is just something that it pops up in almost every single photo. It's really subtle. I'll try to find an example that's up here on the screen, but it's basically when you have a lot of contrasty things, like this shirt might have it. No, and phones are really getting good. But chromatic aberration is just like little chromatic shifts next to certain high contrast spots. Typically at the edge of clothing, or if like you have striped clothing, or there's just a lot of high contrast, you're gonna get these weird artifacts, and this will remove them. Lens correction is completely optional. If you see, it's just removing a little bit. Now this one was shot on a phone. Let's see if we can find one. So that's a rundown of everything in the entire Lightroom panel. So now what I wanna show you is masks. This is where this app is so good, and the best thing about it is if you can understand this, you can understand it on your desktop, and it gets even more powerful. But this is where like the magic really happens. So I'd referred to earlier as all of these different settings are global, meaning they're affecting the whole entire image. Masking, we're just gonna affect local, small, subtle edits that when done right and built on top of each other, just take seconds, but make a huge difference in your edit. So let's take a look. Let's go to a mask. So do you know what the word photography means? It means painting with light. And the reason why that's so important is because what we wanna do is our eye is gonna go to whatever the brightest part of the image is. And so if we know that our eye is gonna go to the brightest spot, well then now what we wanna do is we want to use that to our advantage and make sure that everybody goes exactly where we want them to look. So where do I want them to look? I want them to see the activity. We're having a glass of beer. We want to see her beautiful face smiling. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna click the plus button, and I'm gonna grab a radial gradient. Now there's all of these different tools, and we'll go through them in a second. And now I can just click and drag on the screen, and I can now adjust the light and just crank up the exposure ever so slightly, you know? Not even that much, just ever so slightly. And now whenever you adjust the exposure, you should also make a habit of going in and maybe adjusting a little bit of contrast But really what you'd wanna do is add a little bit of saturation, because when you add light to a thing, you lose a lot of saturation, so you need to add a little bit more saturation. So boom, nice, subtle. So now what I can do is I can take it even a step further. By clicking on the mask, I can now get an option to duplicate and invert this mask. So now I have the exact same mask. Now I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger. And now I brought attention to her face. So now I want to take away attention from the rest of the scene. And this is typically how I do my vignettes, but I would go to light, and now I would just bring the exposure down ever so slightly. And again, I might go into my color and then bring the saturation down ever so slightly. And so we can already see what that's doing to the image. It's already having a pretty nice impact. So we can go and take it even further. We can click the plus button and we can select the subject, which is gonna pull Megan, the cups, my hand, a little bit of this. So I'm not happy with all of the bottom part. So all I have to do is just click the plus or minus below it, subtract from the mask, grab a brush, and I'm just gonna roughly brush over the edge. And I'm not even taking too much care to be perfect, but now all I have to do is just come in here and I can adjust the lightness again, add a little bit of highlights, take a little bit of shadows down, and I'm just creating a little bit of contrast, and maybe I'll make it a little bit warmer. So that's before, that's after. And now I'm thinking the whole thing is a little bit too bright. So now I can just come into the global part and just crank my exposure down a little bit, maybe my highlights. So that's the power of masks. Now, real quick, I also wanna show you, let's find one that has a cool sky. Okay, so here's an image that we'll try playing with the sky with. So I'm gonna go to the mask and I'm gonna click on the plus button and I'm gonna ask it to select the sky, and it'll detect the sky and it'll select it for me. This is really, really cool, and I'll show you a couple of things that you can do with this. One, I can, if it's a hazy day, I can go into my effects and I can dehaze it a little bit, and as you can see, it's starting to bring out like a little bit of drama and contrast in the sky. It's the before and after, which is cool. I can get a little bit of clarity on it as well, which kind of gives it like an HDR look, and I can add some texture to it. So that's one cool thing that you can do to your skies. And then another thing is we can come in here, and because we selected all the sky, but if we didn't want to affect the sky, but we wanted to affect everything else, well, we can come in here, select on it, duplicate and invert the mask, and then now I can make certain things brighter, add more contrast, a little bit of highlights and shadows, and make things pop. So one thing I realized I forgot to go through earlier is this effects panel and the texture, clarity, and dehaze. So texture works really good on clothes. You can add texture to the clothes, but what you can do is you can also remove a little bit of texture from the face to make the skin look a little bit smoother. Those are the two most common things that I use it for, at least. So texture, if I just crank it up, you can see like, yeah, texture pops and the details pop. And then when I take it down, you can see it gets a little bit smoother, a little bit more dreamier looking. It has like a nice pleasing look on the highlights. This is kind of a cool like halation effect, and it can get really pronounced when you add it with clarity. So let's remove texture and clarity. So if I add clarity, again, it kind of gives like this contrasty, it's like just another punchy contrasty effect. And then again, it'll remove clarity and it kind of gives like this beautiful, like dreamy look. And then when I add dehaze, again, almost looks like it's adding a lot of contrast because there's no sky in this one. But what it'll work on really well is if you're in a foggy, hazy space, you can remove it a little bit. Don't get too carried away. It'll really bring out a lot of like nasty details. But then we can also go ahead the other way and add haze. I really like to add haze when there's water involved. I just wanna go over a couple more things that you can do with the sky. I'm gonna add a plus, select the sky, and let's just add the effect dehaze just to kind of see what it looks like. It kind of gives a nice texture to the clouds, adds a lot of drama to it, in my opinion. But don't get too carried away with it. We could also go ahead and make it kind of like completely white out if we wanted to. That's adding some haze. But one of the things that we could do is we can kind of add our own sun effect. So as we can see, the sun is kind of coming up from the top right. So I can lean into that. And this is where I think masking is just the coolest. So I'm gonna press the plus button. I'm gonna select the radial gradient, and I'm gonna draw a little radial gradient right here. And I'm just gonna add, like the sun's kind of coming off the edge. I'm gonna just add some temperature and then just a little bit of brightness. And then look at that, the before and after of that, before, after. It just kind of adds like this nice drama to it. That's really cool. And again, we can go ahead and select the sky. but then use that to go ahead and invert it so that way I can get just the building. So I'm gonna just double click, duplicate and invert, and then I'm gonna go to brightness, I'm gonna go to contrast and just kind of crank it up. And now I can kind of make those buildings pop a little bit. And now let's say the edge is just too much. So I can still add to these masks. I'm gonna go ahead and subtract, and I'm gonna do a linear gradient. And now I'm just gonna make this mask just gently get into it. So now before and after, you can see this is a really powerful tool. So these are all the things that I really like about Lightroom Mobile. They all also work on Lightroom Desktop. This is a cloud-based app. So once you're logged in, whatever changes you make here is also gonna show up on your desktop. It's also gonna show up on your tablet. Whatever you use to edit, it'll all be synced across. So if a cat comes on your keyboard and you forget about what you're doing, later on, when you're on the train, you can go ahead and continue to edit. Hopefully you learned a couple things from this video. If you've made it this far, you definitely care about improving your photography and your videography and editing. So definitely recommend subscribing to the channel. If you have any questions about anything specific that you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.